Montana Territory, 1869. Dust swirled across the parched earth of the frontier, where hope often withered beneath the relentless sun. This was no place for the faint of heart, and certainly no place for a lone man. Yet that was precisely what Jackson Forrester believed as he guided his chestnut mare across the rolling plains, the weight of solitude as familiar as the Colt revolver at his hip. At 25, Jackson had the lean, muscled build of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. His clean-shaven face was sun-bronzed and handsome, though few ever noticed the subtle sadness in his deep blue eyes. He wore the standard uniform of his trade, worn denim, leather chaps, and a cream-colored Stetson pulled low against the glare. The young cowboy had learned early that attachment was a luxury the West did not permit. A man alone answers to no one but himself and the land. His father had told him before dying of fever 5 winters past. Jackson had taken those words and forged them into a shield. The frontier was for surviving, not loving. Family meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. Better to drift with the seasons, working cattle drives in summer, trapping in winter, and keeping his heart as untethered as tumbleweed. What Jackson wanted was simple: enough money saved to buy his own plot of land where he could build a modest cabin, raise horses, and live by his own rules. What he needed, though he would have sooner admitted to fearing rattlesnakes than acknowledge it, was to fill the hollow ache that expanded with each passing season of solitude. As the sun dipped toward the distant mountains, Jackson spotted thin wisps of smoke rising from a chimney in the valley below. According to his rough map, this should be the Sullivan homestead, where he'd been told they might need hands for the coming cattle season. He hadn't planned to stop until morning, but something about the isolated cabin, standing brave and defiant against the vastness of the territory, made him turn his horse downward. The silence struck him first. Homesteads usually buzzed with activity: chickens scratching, tools clanging, voices calling. This place felt abandoned, though the smoke suggested otherwise. Jackson's hand instinctively moved toward his gun as he approached. "Hello, the house," he called, keeping a respectful distance. The door creaked open, and Jackson found himself staring down the barrel of a rifle held by what appeared to be a child no older than 10. "State your business," the boy demanded, his young voice straining to sound authoritative. Before Jackson could answer, a woman's voice called from inside. "Timothy James, you put that rifle down this instant." The door swung wider, revealing a young woman, perhaps 22 years of age. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical braid that couldn't quite contain the wispy curls framing her face. Despite the simplicity of her blue calico dress and flour-dusted apron, Jackson was struck by her beauty, not the painted beauty of saloon girls, but something deeper that made him straighten in his saddle. "I apologize for the welcome," she said, stepping onto the porch while keeping a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "We don't get many visitors, and those we do aren't always friendly." 2 smaller children, a girl about 7 and a boy no more than 4, peered from behind her skirts, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Name's Jackson Forrester, ma'am. I was told the Sullivan place might be hiring hands for the season." The woman's expression faltered. "I'm Patricia Jameson. The Sullivans, they're gone. Fever took them last winter." Jackson removed his hat. "My condolences. I'll be on my way then." He was turning his horse when she spoke again, her voice catching. "Mr. Forrester? The Sullivans were my sister and her husband. I came from Ohio to help after they fell ill, but I arrived too late." Her chin lifted slightly. "I'm trying to keep the ranch running for the children's sake." In that moment, everything Jackson had built his life around told him to ride away. A woman alone with 3 children spelled trouble, attachment, and responsibility, everything he'd sworn to avoid. Yet something in her determined stance made him pause. "You planning to work this place yourself, ma'am?" "I don't have much choice." Her green eyes flashed with a pride that dared him to suggest otherwise. That night, as Jackson made camp a respectable distance from the homestead, he told himself he'd move on in the morning. One woman couldn't possibly maintain a cattle ranch, even with hired help. It was a fool's errand. Yet as he stared at the stars, the image of Patricia standing defiantly on that porch, 3 children behind her, and a world of trouble ahead, kept returning to him. Morning brought the sound of splitting wood and a string of very unladylike curses. Jackson found Patricia struggling with an axe, attempting to chop firewood. Without a word, he took the tool from her hands. Mr. Forrester, I didn't ask for, call me Jackson, he interrupted, swinging the axe with practiced ease. And no, you didn't ask. Consider it payment for letting me water my horse at your creek. By midday, Jackson had split enough wood to last a week, repaired a broken wagon wheel, and was assessing the condition of the barn. The children watched him with open fascination, especially little Matthew, the 4-year-old who followed him like a shadow. Why are you helping us? Patricia asked as she brought him a cup of water, her voice somewhere between suspicion and hope. Jackson shrugged. Heading to Wyoming anyway. No rush. We can't pay much, she admitted. But we can offer meals in the loft and the barn. I've slept worse places. Jackson didn't mention he'd slept better ones too. What was meant to be one night became 2, then a week. Patricia explained how her sister and brother-in-law had built something promising before illness struck. The ranch had good water, decent grazing land, and a small herd of 30 cattle. But without help, everything was slowly falling apart. During supper one evening, Timothy asked bluntly, "Are you staying to marry Aunt Patty?" Patricia's face flushed crimson. Timothy, what? Ma always said a woman needs a husband out here, and you said yourself we need help with the cattle. That's enough, Patricia said firmly. Mr. Forrester is just passing through. He's being kind enough to help us for now. Jackson stared at his plate, uncomfortable with how the boy's question had made his heart race. I'm not the marrying kind, he said flatly. The frontier's no place for attachments. People die, they leave. Best to count on yourself. Later, as Jackson repaired a fence line, Patricia approached with a canteen. I want to apologize for Timothy. He speaks without thinking sometimes. No harm done. I also want to clarify something. She looked directly at him. I'm not looking for a husband, Mr. Forrester. I came west because my sister needed me, and now these children need me. I may not know everything about ranching, but I'm learning. What I need is fair work for fair pay, not someone to save me. Jackson felt both relieved and oddly disappointed. Understood, Miss Jameson. As spring melted into summer, Jackson found himself still at the Jameson homestead. He told himself it was the practical arrangement. Room and board plus a small wage was better than he'd get elsewhere. He didn't examine why he fixed things that didn't strictly need fixing, or why he spent evenings teaching Timothy to track, or why the sound of Patricia's rare laughter made his chest tighten. One evening, as Jackson sat on the porch whittling a small wooden horse for Matthew, 7-year-old Sarah settled beside him. Are you afraid of something? She asked with childlike directness. Jackson's knife paused. What makes you think that? You always look sad when you think nobody sees you. Like you're remembering something scary. Jackson resumed his carving. Everyone's afraid of something, little one. I'm afraid of thunder, she confided. And Timothy's afraid of wolves. Aunt Patty's afraid we'll have to leave the ranch. And what about your little brother? Sarah looked thoughtful. Matthew's afraid you'll go away. He told me so. Jackson stared at the half-finished horse in his hands, feeling something crack in the walls he'd built around himself. The next morning brought news that changed everything. A rider from the nearest town delivered mail, including an official-looking letter that left Patricia pale and shaking. What is it? Jackson asked when the rider had gone. The bank in Helena, she said, her voice hollow. They're calling in my brother-in-law's loan. We have 60 days to pay $400, or they'll seize the property. $400 might as well have been $4,000. Even with a good cattle sale, they couldn't raise that much so quickly. There has to be a way, Jackson said, surprising himself with his vehemence. Maybe in town, Patricia suggested, though they both knew what options awaited a young woman desperate for money. No, Jackson said sharply. We'll think of something else. We. The word hung between them, neither acknowledging how naturally it had come to his lips. That night, after the children were asleep, Patricia found Jackson in the barn preparing for a journey. You're leaving, she said flatly. I'll be back in 3 weeks. Jackson continued saddling his horse. There's a cattle drive starting in Great Falls. They'll need experienced hands. The children will miss you. Jackson paused. Just the children? Patricia looked away. It would be selfish to say more. You've been clear about not wanting attachments, and I respect that. We've already kept you longer than you intended. Patricia. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and it made her look up. I'm coming back. In the 3 weeks Jackson was gone, Patricia threw herself into the ranch work with renewed determination. She mended fences until her hands bled, taught Sarah to collect eggs without breaking them, and spent every evening poring over her brother-in-law's ledgers looking for any asset she might have overlooked. The day Jackson was due to return came and went. Then another. By the third day, Patricia found herself standing on the porch each evening, scanning the horizon while pretending to hang laundry or shell peas. On the fifth day, Timothy spoke the fear they'd all been harboring. "He's not coming back, is he?" Patricia forced a smile. "Mr. Forrester has his own life, Timothy. We knew he wouldn't stay forever." "But he promised," Matthew insisted, his lower lip trembling. That night, as a summer storm rolled across the plains, Patricia sat alone at the kitchen table. She'd been a fool to hope, to imagine that Jackson Forrester might see them as more than a temporary obligation. Men like him didn't settle, they roamed. She'd learned that lesson watching her sister pine for letters from a husband who was always chasing the next opportunity, the next strike, the next herd. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard. For an instant, Patricia thought she saw a rider. When thunder crashed seconds later, she told herself it was wishful thinking, until frantic pounding rattled the door. She grabbed the rifle and approached cautiously. "Who's there?" "It's Jackson," came the ragged reply. "I'm hurt, Patricia." She flung open the door to find him drenched and clutching his side, blood seeping between his fingers. With surprising strength, she helped him inside and eased him onto a chair. "What happened?" she demanded, already gathering cloths and heating water. "Rustlers," he managed. "Tried to take the cattle money. Got careless." As she cleaned, the bullet wound in his side. Thankfully, a clean pass-through that had missed anything vital. Patricia alternated between relief at his return and fury at his recklessness. "You could have been killed," she scolded, pressing a bandage firmly against his side. "Was more worried about this," Jackson said, reaching into his jacket with his good arm to produce a leather pouch. $370. Not enough, but you risked your life for money. Patricia's voice broke. "For our debt." "For your home," he corrected. "For the children's future." "And what about your future?" she demanded. "You always said you wanted your own land, not to be tied to someone else's problems." Jackson's hand caught hers. "Maybe what I thought I wanted isn't what I need." The following days brought a change to the homestead. Jackson's injury forced him to slow down, to accept help, to sit still long enough for conversations that went beyond cattle and weather. He taught Timothy to play checkers using buttons and cloth scraps. He listened to Sarah read haltingly from Patricia's worn Bible. He let Matthew curl against his good side during evening stories. Most significantly, he talked with Patricia, really talked, during the quiet hours after the children slept. He told her about growing up with a father who moved their camp each season, never settling, never connecting. How he'd watched his mother wither from loneliness until fever finally took her. How he'd promised himself never to need anyone that much. In turn, Patricia shared her fears of failing the children, of losing the only home they'd known, of being inadequate to the task her sister had unknowingly left her. "I never wanted children," she admitted one evening. "In Ohio, I taught school and planned to live independently. But when Emily's letter came saying they were ill," she traced the wood grain of the table. "Now I can't imagine life without them." "They're lucky to have you," Jackson said quietly. "We're lucky to have you," she returned, then quickly added, "for as long as you choose to stay." 2 weeks before the bank's deadline, just as Jackson's wound had healed enough for light work, a dust cloud on the horizon announced visitors. 3 riders approached, their manner suggesting this was no social call. "Get the children inside," Jackson told Patricia, who didn't argue. The leader introduced himself as Garrett Walsh, representative of the Helena Banking Association. His companions were clearly hired muscle, not bankers. "We've come to inspect the property," Walsh announced with thin courtesy. "The bank prefers to know what it's acquiring." "The debt isn't due for another 2 weeks, Jackson pointed out. Walsh smiled unpleasantly. "Let's not pretend, Mr. Forrester." "Mr. Forrester. We all know Mrs. Sullivan won't meet the payment. My employer is simply being thorough." "It's Miss Jameson, actually." Mrs. Sullivan was her sister. Walsh raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? That complicates matters. If Miss Jameson has no legal claim to this property, my sister and her husband left a will," Patricia interrupted, stepping onto the porch despite Jackson's warning glance. "The ranch belongs to the children, with me as their guardian." Children can't own property, Walsh countered smoothly. Without a male guardian, the courts will likely assign a trustee, who would, of course, liquidate the assets to provide for their care. Jackson felt cold fury rising. You've made your inspection. Now kindly leave until the actual deadline. After the men departed, Patricia sat heavily on the porch steps. They're not even going to wait for us to fail. They're going to take the children's home on a technicality. Jackson paced, thinking hard. Patricia, do you trust me? She looked up, surprised. Yes. Why? Because I have an idea. It's unconventional, and you may hate it, but it might save the ranch. That evening, after explaining his plan and giving her time to consider it, Jackson took Patricia for a walk while the children finished their chores. The setting sun painted the plains in gold and shadow, a beauty that still caught him by surprise sometimes. You don't have to answer now, he said. I know it's not what either of us planned. Patricia stopped walking. Why, Jackson? Is it just for the ranch? For the children? He turned to face her. It started that way. A practical solution. But he struggled and used to voicing feelings he'd spent years denying. I've spent my life believing attachment meant weakness, that caring for people just gave life more weapons to hurt you with. And now, Patricia's voice was barely above a whisper. Now I know that was the real weakness, being so afraid of loss that I never let myself have anything worth losing. He took her hand. I can't promise I'll be perfect at this, but I want to try. With you, with the children. If you'll have me. 2 days later, Patricia stood before the small town's preacher in her sister's blue silk dress, saved for special occasions, while Jackson wore a hastily purchased suit that made him look both uncomfortable and handsome. Timothy stood proudly as man of the family, while Sarah clutched a bouquet of wildflowers and Matthew fidgeted until Jackson scooped him up halfway through the ceremony. The following morning, when Walsh and his men returned, they found Jackson Forrester on the porch, legal papers in hand, and a wedding band on his finger. Gentlemen, he greeted them. I believe you're looking for my wife, Mrs. Patricia Forrester. Walsh's confident smirk faded as he reviewed the marriage certificate and the newly drawn papers naming Jackson as the children's legal guardian and co-owner of the property. This doesn't resolve the debt, he said coldly. Jackson reached into his pocket and withdrew the leather pouch, now containing the full $400, the additional funds borrowed from neighbors who'd attended their hasty wedding and learned of their predicament. I believe it does. That night, with the children finally asleep after the excitement of the day, Patricia found Jackson on the porch, staring at the stars. Having regrets already? She asked lightly, though uncertainty tinged her voice. He turned, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. Just thinking about my father. He always said a man alone answers only to himself. I spent years believing that was freedom. And now, Jackson pulled her gently toward him. Now I know he was wrong. A man alone is just that, alone. He glanced toward the house where the children slept. When I found you here, alone with 3 children, I thought I was just passing through. I never expected that your family would get bigger, Patricia finished, smiling up at him. Our family, he corrected, and sealed the promise with a kiss. As summer turned to autumn, the Forrester ranch saw many changes. The barn was repaired, the herd expanded, and the house gained a new room for the boys. Timothy stopped introducing himself as a Sullivan and proudly became a Forrester. Sarah lost her fear of thunderstorms when Jackson taught her to count the seconds between lightning and thunder. Matthew finally stopped worrying that Jackson would leave. And on cool evenings, when the work was done and the children dreaming, Patricia would often find her husband on the porch, watching the sunset with contentment rather than restlessness in his eyes. Still think the frontier is no place for love? She would ask, settling beside him. And Jackson, who once believed the West too harsh for tender things, would pull her close and answer, no. I think it's exactly where love belongs, to make the wild parts bearable and the hard times worth enduring. On one such evening, as the first snow of winter dusted the distant mountains, Jackson watched his wife rocking in the chair he'd built her, her hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her belly. In the spring, their family would grow again. The thought that once would have sent him riding for the horizon now filled him with quiet joy. The lone cowboy who had found a woman and 3 children struggling to survive had discovered something he hadn't known he was seeking. Not just people to care for, but a place where his wandering heart could finally rest. The family that necessity had created, love had transformed, turning strangers into something unbreakable, something that belonged solely and perfectly to the home they had built together.